Hello everyone, welcome to this evening at Petersham Bowling Club to the wonderful Readers, Books and Conversation event. For those of you who haven't been before, my name is Michaela Kalowski and I get to work at the PBC and choose wonderful authors for this conversation, and it's just great to have you all with us tonight. If you are, I think most people are sitting down the front, which is fabulous. We're going to say we're a beautiful, more intimate crowd tonight, so we'd love you to be a bit closer. That's lovely. I wanted to welcome Marina Kamenev, who's our guest this evening, the author of Kin, and which is her debut work of non-fiction, and in a moment I'm going to tell you a bit more about the book and also about her. I want to first acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land that we meet on tonight, and to pay my deep respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here this evening. This book, Kin, and I'm really glad you're here because I imagine that the book only came out really in March, so I don't know if any of you have had a chance to read it yet. It's that very rare thing for a debut work and a work of non-fiction. It's enormously complex, its scope is huge, and it's unputdownable, which is actually pretty unusual, I think. It is a fascinating and also really moving investigation into how families are created, who gets to make a family, and how we use technology to help us shape the families we want. At the heart of the book are very big questions, and Marina's gift as a writer is that she lets you sit with them. The questions are about choice, about agency, about love, about selfhood. The book is packed full of detailed research and interviews with people who chose not to have children, people who will do anything they can to have children, single parents by choice, sperm and egg donors, people who choose to be surrogates, rainbow families, and people who discovered later in life that they were created using anonymous sperm or egg donation. The book is wide-ranging and it does something incredible. Throughout the book we hear from people who desperately wanted to make a child, and we hear from the children themselves who were created about what their life means to them. So you can hear we have a lot to get through this evening. We're going to do something a little bit unusual. Marina and I will speak for 45 minutes. We will leave a good 15 minutes at the end for your comments or your questions, and there'll be a roving microphone and we'll turn the lights back on. But we thought we wanted to play with the format a bit. The first half of our 45 minutes will be really just focusing on the book. And the second half is that when we were preparing tonight's conversation, we just kept noticing these extraordinary news stories, coming out of the Alabama Supreme Court that suddenly an embryo outside the body has selfhood, or coming out of Missouri, the Guardian's article about how there's still a law in Missouri that says you can't get divorced if you're pregnant, or the news that one of the Wiggles is at 43 is having a baby on her own with a donor egg. So all these news stories that completely pertain to everything Marina was investigating. So the second half of our time together tonight, we're going to talk about some of those news stories and have Marina kind of illuminate them for us. And we'd really love to hear from you at the end, so keep your questions in mind as we're going along. You will have noticed the beautiful book table up the back from Berklau Books, our wonderful bookseller. She is up there, and at the end you can buy a copy or many copies of Kin and talk to Marina, have them signed, which would be wonderful. I want to tell you a little bit about Marina Kamenev before we kick off. Marina is an investigative writer. She's the former deputy arts editor of the Moscow Times, and she's been widely published in The Atlantic, Time, Sunday Life, The Monthly and Marie Claire, writing often about family. She lives in Sydney, though she was born in Russia, and she's the mother of 2 children. Kin is her first book, and as I said, we are enormously happy to be supporting debut writers at the Petersham Bowling Club. Please join me in making her very welcome. So, Marina, I wanted to, as I said in the intro, the book covers so much. Who gets to be a parent and how, the technology that we've used for decades in order to have children or not have children, the new technology that's on offer now. And also you write about how the law in different countries and states views all of that technology and what those laws reflect about our cultures, our moral, social, religious, cultural kind of ideas. And you trace the way families have perhaps always included a variety of structures, but we tend to still have this idea of the family unit as nuclear and as being kind of narrow, and we think of the family still, even despite all this amazing kind of history you give us, in these very limiting kind of ways. And the book is about this ongoing struggle for both the rights of parents and the rights of children. And I wanted to start by asking you where the idea came from for you that became this book, Kin, with all of its scope. What got you thinking about it in a way that interested you enough to dedicate a whole book to it?
So I started off, I was looking, there was an article about the Victoria, the parliamentary inquiry that was going to make sperm donors de-identified. So people who donated anonymously in the 70s or in the 80s were no longer going to be anonymous. And there was a woman called Marina Kamenev, and at first I thought it was unfair to change the law in terms of journalism with donor confidentiality, in terms of confidentiality of sources. I kind of thought that's really rubbish if people signed on to do one thing and something else happens. And Marina Kamenev, a donor conceived person who was trying to campaign for the laws to change, was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. And it wasn't on her mother's side, and she didn't know who her biological father was, but she knew she had siblings who were likely to be predisposed to the condition, and her life, my mind changed. And it made sense.
She had a really good reason she had to know who her father was.
And her siblings had to know.
Yeah.
And it was just that flick of the switch, which rarely happens. I think people really rarely change their minds, so I kind of paid attention to it, and I paid attention to the issue. And then that was in 2013, and in 2019 I read an article for a monthly about the sperm drought.
The sperm drought? The sperm drought. Please tell us about the sperm drought.
So there's no drought, there's a supply and demand issue where, basic economics, and there's too much demand and not enough supply, and that's partly due to legislation. But there's also this online world of sperm donors who are very happy to donate on Facebook, etc., etc. So it was just a whole new world, and it raised more questions, and it also kind of made me realise that my boring family was a privilege in some ways.
That's so interesting. You said that before tonight's conversation, and Marina starts the book in this wonderful way where she says, take a pen and a bit of paper and draw a family. And 9 times out of 10, anecdotally, we're going to draw 2 adults and 2 children. And you said you kind of discovered something when you were thinking about the idea of the nuclear family, of the man and the woman, or the 2 adults and 2 children, that you, thinking about the nuclear family, you kind of realised something about how you'd been able to make a family that was different to the way other people had been able to make a family. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I just did it the boring way, especially how I do it.
I told you it's a wide range.
No, but I think I was sort of confusing social acceptance of these other families for equality, and there wasn't equality. No one's asked me why I had kids. No one's ever questioned me whether I'm the real mother. No one's the paperwork fits, with my pronouns. Everything just is kind of easy, and I'm sort of undetected. Whereas I find that, I found through interviews that other families have to kind of justify their reproductive choices and.
Well, as you write in the book, they have to really fight to get any kind of access to it.
Yeah, exactly. And also pay more. I mean, Medicare rebates don't cover social infertility. So if I was infertile and my husband was infertile, it would be cheaper to use IVF, whereas for single women and
so that's what we mean by social infertility, which is that I want to have a baby and I can, but I'm not in a relationship where I can do it, as you say, the traditional boring way. The boring way, right.
Yeah, but medical infertility, so there's different types of infertility, and one kind of gets rewarded and the other doesn't.
Yeah, wow. We are going to get into tonight. I want to ask Marina about IVF and about surrogacy and about the shame and stigma around infertility that persists for men and for women. I don't want to dwell too long on the whole notion of the nuclear family, but I didn't know, the book is kind of a revelation. You read chapter after chapter, and every chapter kind of discusses the history of the technology that's kind of being investigated. But I didn't know that the nuclear family was kind of a fluke. And I just wondered if you could just take us through that quickly. Like, when did the nuclear family, the kind of concept of it, come up? And why do we still hang on to it if it was really only connected to this one little pocket in history?
Well, it came up after the war. I mean, it was always there. But post-industrialization, people were moving to cities, and so there was a separation between kind of parents and children. After the World War, there was World War II in particular, there was kind of this return to order. The nuclear family represented that, and also the economy was doing great, so you could survive on one salary. So you could get married younger if you wanted to. People used to save up to get married, so they could buy a house, etc., etc. I mean, now no one's going to buy a house.
Yeah. But, and no one's going to get married. No one's saving up.
No. And so, yeah, you could, and it was a neat little bundle. So, like sex, reproduction,
invisible
romance,
labour, not paying certain people for certain jobs. Yeah, it worked. Yeah.
Until sort of the 70s, where there was sort of a worldwide, there was a recession of sorts, and you needed two people to work. And the interesting thing that happened at the time as well was that kids used to kind of help economically before. And then kids became expensive. So that was kind of something that's really interesting, because you needed to work to afford the kids, and eventually you needed two salaries.
To be able to afford all the things you had to do to be a good parent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There's a great thing that Marina talks about, which talks about parenting now being a verb. And it used to not be a verb. It used to just be something that you did, just a noun. It wasn't something so active. And you're right, it costs money.
It's very expensive.
Yeah. Let's start. I want to dive into some of the topics you write about really beautifully in the book. Let's talk about donors, sperm and egg donors. How long have we relied on sperm donation? Like, what are the first kind of cases we have where, like, right, that's how we managed to give that family a child?
I don't know if we relied on it, but in the sort of early 20th century it existed, but behind closed doors.
Okay.
And it was kind of like, it was interesting because the doctors were sort of ahead of their time by saying it doesn't matter, paternity doesn't matter, and but equally they encouraged families to lie and keep up the facade. So probably since the first known case was in the 1800s, the official one, but in the early 1900s, and often medical students, and it relied, but all behind closed doors and all anonymous. And the being anonymous was sort of a source of pride that the children would never find out.
Yeah, wow. So it begins in it's got a long history, this idea of what you do with the shame of not being able to make a child.
Yeah, and particularly, I guess, for men, where virility is kind of associated with masculinity, so being infertile really carried a particular sort of shame.
Yeah. You detail in the book, and you said it before, that you wrote this article for the Monthly, which was about the sperm drought, so to speak, and it wasn't enough to meet the demand that people had. But in Australia, like, where would you go in New South Wales if you wanted sperm, and how has that changed in the in the 30 or 40 years of research you look at in this book? How has that changed? Like, it seemed like it used to be, you said it used to be anonymous and now it's not anonymous. Like, are people paid for it? How does it work?
Well, you would go to a fertility clinic, which you kind of always did to some extent, but one of the things that happened was the invention of being able to thaw sperm. So frozen sperm really made a big difference because we could import sperm. And it's tricky because a lot of so you're not allowed to get paid as a sperm donor, and recently you're not allowed to be anonymous, which is neither here nor there because of DNA sort of.
They can find you either way.
Yeah, and they're getting cheaper and more sort of available. But a lot of the sperm gets imported from America, and it's not like American men are more generous than Australian men. They're most likely, I don't want to get sued, but they're probably paid. So it's a funny thing because we don't allow people to donate, like we don't allow people to pay, give money for donations here, but equally we're happy to import.
Yeah, right. When we talk about the 1980s in Australia, because you talk, I'm thinking about Ian Smith in the book, and also Michael and Miff. There were these men who donated sperm in the 1980s and didn't think much about it. It was just something that they did. But they changed their minds later on, and the book is full of these really powerful individual anecdotal stories. Tell us a bit about someone like Ian.
Yeah, Ian's lovely. I actually got to meet him in Melbourne face to face, but he donated, I think in the early 1980s, but it was after, it would have been the late 1980s. It was after AIDS, so they were particularly looking for heterosexual men.
Okay.
He just broke up with someone, he was single at the time, and he kind of just wanted to help. But he was also told that it was probably for research, so the idea that there'd be children out there was kind of abstract anyway. And then he met his wife, and she asked him to stop. And years later, he got sort of a letter saying that children exist and they'll no longer be using his sperm. And he was really surprised by it, and he had his own 2 kids by then, so it was this century, I think early this century.
Yeah.
And strangely enough, he was happy to be identified. So, which is what doctors were worried about, that all these sperm donors would not want to be identified, and he didn't have a problem with it either way. Maybe because he had kids.
Yeah.
in Israel.
One of the things that you do really powerfully in this book, as I said in the intro, is you give space to the voices and opinions and experiences of people who were also created using this technology, which I thought was so fascinating. What did some of them tell you about how they felt about discovering that they were created using donor sperm? How they feel about their life, about being alive, I mean?
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's the one sort of commonality that they rushed to the mirror and they kind of became really uncomfortable with their sense of self. And I guess also being lied to, you know, for decades at a time is probably really unpleasant in any sphere, but particularly when it comes to your identity. I mean, there was one guy who was really fixated with the idea that he had German ancestry, Alan Muse, and then to find out that that wasn't true. Like he'd researched it, he'd gone to Germany, he'd visited the town that his ancestors were from, and none of that was real. So it was really discombobulating and awful.
Yeah. I want to ask about donor eggs as well.
Okay.
That seems to be an interesting kind of new landscape because it seemed to sort of change two things. One is the idea that love and sex could be separated from procreation. You know, you didn't even need to have sex to procreate.
Yeah.
And the other is this notion of who the mother is.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what you discovered writing about egg donation in that way?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting. So Australia had a lot of firsts after the UK, and one of them was the first child born to egg donation. It was in 1983. And it was the idea that the woman that gave birth to that child was the child's mother, but equally the technology allows for surrogacy. So it causes a real schism with motherhood. And you sort of have to decide who, like, intent plays a part, and it's really different. And I guess historically, or like evolution-wise, we were always worried about paternal uncertainty, and now it's kind of created the opportunity for maternal uncertainty, which, you know, wasn't the equaliser we were waiting for, but it's still like a
different kind of equality, really. Yeah. I want to ask about IVF. There's a new film coming about Louise Brown called Joy. You might have seen the trailer. It's got Bill Nye and Thomasin McKenzie in it, and it's a beautiful name for a film. And Louise Brown was the first child born. They called the first test tube baby, and it's a misnomer. There was no test tube involved. Born using IVF in the UK, but Australia wasn't very far behind. Can you tell us about how IVF took off in Australia and what the kind of regulatory framework around it was at that time?
Yeah, so the UK had the first two test tube babies, and they kind of, at the time, it was horrific. She was called a Franken baby, and it was kind of like what we would, if someone decided to clone a person, that's how people felt about it. So in today's terms. And actually I was reading about the UK today, and because they didn't have ovulation tests and they didn't stimulate ovulation, they kind of put all these women stayed in one that were going through IVF. It was very secretive. They were told not to tell anyone, not to pick up phone calls from journalists, and they had to test their urine every 3 hours. So they stayed 6 to a room. They had to carry a bucket, like a plastic container, around with them.
Wow.
And they were all woken up in the middle of the night every 3 hours to test their urine. So Australia did things a bit differently in that they stimulated ovulation. So you could kind of you could know what was going to happen, but it also made women produce more eggs. But this created the issue of too many embryos, which and even before we had the technology to use frozen embryos, this is how that kind of issue started, because you were creating more than you needed.
Yeah, right. Unbelievable. You write about all the way through the book, every time there's a technological advance, Marina has this fantastic way of kind of bringing in all the headlines from around the world, and they are hysterically kind of catastrophic. You know, the world is ending because of a test tube baby, or, you know, where they are fearful, whether they're writing in the 1940s or they're writing in the 1960s or they're writing in the 1990s. The level of hysteria doesn't change. And I wondered, we'll talk about it a bit soon when we get to talking about Alabama, but what frightens people about these technological advances? Why does it freak people out so much when what it does is allow people, and I'm not arguing for it, but I'm saying at the heart of it, it's not like people are like, oh, I don't really want to grow purple cabbages, but here's the technology to grow purple cabbages. You're giving people the thing they desperately want. They're desperate for a child, and they will do almost anything to have a child. Why is the technology so kind of demonized?
It's it's funny because it's like part of it is the idea of it being unnatural, and the idea, you know, Christian conservatives often coin things unnatural when it's something they don't like, whether it's homosexuality or technology. It's unnatural. You know, homosexuality does. Look, there's animals that are homosexual, to my knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
So all of the stuff that is natural, you know, wouldn't necessarily be Christian anyway, but it's that term of natural and unnatural, and it also is just like it messes with when life begins. It used to be the quickening, when you could feel the child move. That was thought to be
the beginning of life.
The beginning of life, and it wasn't that. So an idea of it happening outside the body, and that you could just create a person like you create a lasagna. Like it's a really, you know.
Reminds me of one of those fake 1950s cartoons I saw years ago, which was two very well-dressed women talking to each other, and one says, "Congratulations, I just heard you had a baby," and the other says, "Thank you, it was delicious." Crazy. I'll send it around. It's very funny. There's so much in this as well, and I do want to come back to the kind of whole notion of who gets to decide when life begins and why. Like why it matters so much to certain people to say it's this point and not that point. And it does remind me of something that I read from Margaret Atwood, who talked about the conservatives in the United States in particular, and mostly in the United States, who said that they care enormously about a human life until the child is born. And then when the child is born, it's someone else's fault or it's someone else's problem. And that's, there's a really interesting article Marina sent to me about the enormous rise at the moment in the US in particular of the rates of infant mortality and maternal mortality, because people are unwell and they're having terrible complications, or they're physically unwell and their society and their community is unwell and they can't get medical support. I want to move, before we get to some of our news stories, I want to move on to the idea of, you talk in the book about, the ancient structures of family, and also the way that we have these we think of them as new structures of family. Although I was talking to people before this evening who told me different stories about their families or families they know, and it's clear that we all have our own iterations and our own constructions of how we have a caring family kind of unit. But you talk about your rainbow families in the book, and you talk about guild families in the book, and I love the notion of guild families. Can you tell us a bit about what you came across when you were writing, about guild families, about what that is?
So it's not my term, so I don't want to say that. It's a great term, but it's the idea of multi-parent family, and when it works, it's wonderful. So more than two parents, and I think in Canada there's 2 states that allow more than 2 people to be on the birth certificate.
Go Canada.
Yeah. Always, but nowhere else. And it's kind of amazing because kids don't suffer from more people loving them or more people looking after them, and the people, when these families work, not when it came apart, they didn't have that misery that we often experience with parenting in the early days, that isolation, the exhaustion, the loneliness. And so when it works, it's kind of amazing because people can kind of retain an aspect of their identity that they had before children, which often gets eviscerated for women, and go on holidays and have a life.
And also a child gets to benefit from all these other people with all these other skill sets as well. And if you think about the whole idea of it takes a village, like I was joking with someone before that we used to have a village and now we pay a village because we're not in our villages anymore. But it still takes a village, to raise for any kind of caring role. I also, you write about the new landscape that many queer families occupy, and it's a place that has these quite untethered notions of mother and father from gender. And I was really struck by that.
Yeah, and it's kind of, there was one couple, I think, Asaf and his partner, and he said this kind of amazing thing, which was that they just parent according to their skill set, which is incredible. And he said, look, if the mother gives birth, she'd probably feel quite bad going back to work. It was in the news with Marissa Mayer, and when she was the Yahoo CEO, and she was heavily pregnant. I mean, people don't like women going back to work straight after giving birth. So,
although that's a good story because you lose no matter what you do, right? If you go back to work too soon, you're a maniac. You don't go back to work soon enough when you're going back to work.
Exactly.
And all the way through the book, that keeps coming up. This kind of weird kind of shame and stigmatizing and shaming and coercing stuff around particularly what women do, but what lots of parents do.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that came up was kind of the emphasis on biology that they experience from the outside. So not within their family, their parents to their children, but people often ask who's the real father, who's the real mother, and the idea is that the person that's biologically related to the child has more relevance or is a stronger bond.
And you quote a wonderful US academic, I think Susan Golombok in the book, who also has done these kind of longitudinal studies of talking to the children of these families, children of rainbow families and children of different iterations of families. And what can you tell us what she says about what children need?
Yeah, I think it's kind of that cliche of love. She says that the kids are basically all right. Kids do better when they're told before about the age of 7 about if they are donor conceived or if a surrogate was used. So honesty works really well. And they kind of tend to do more or less the same as children who weren't donor conceived, provided that there's an honest relationship. And I guess people who really want kids, they're outliers to this rule, but they tend to be better parents because they want it so much. So wanting the kid is part of it.
Yeah, fascinating. We're going to come to our second half of our conversation, which is the news half, the current affairs news half now. I want to start by talking to you about the recent, the Alabama Supreme Court case. So to give everyone the background, back in 2022, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, the removing of constitutional guarantee of access to abortion in the US, people really warned at that time that many other reproductive rights would soon tumble as well. And Alabama just proved that those fears were absolutely bang on. So the Alabama Supreme Court's recent ruling was that frozen embryos in test tubes should be considered children, and it's opened up an onslaught of questions and ramifications for the reproductive care in that state and in beyond. In Florida look like they're going in the same direction. What does this shift in American law do? What's its impact, and what does it tell us about what's going on in that culture?
So I'm actually going to take you to Louisiana because I didn't get to feature it in the book.
Sure.
So in the 1980s, when we were creating too many embryos, this was a problem that was everywhere. And in Australia and the UK, they decided that the 14-day mark was the mark that you couldn't experiment on an embryo, and it was sort of arbitrary, but it was because it was when the spinal column developed, and what did it say? So they could no longer become twins in a crude sense after 14 days. It was personhood. So the UK and Australia kind of came to that conclusion. In Louisiana, which is quite a conservative state, they wanted to have IVF, but there was a lot of pushback from Christian groups. And so what they decided was that an embryo, and it's slightly different to Alabama, it's a juridical person.
Okay.
But after 3 days, which was even more arbitrary. And this has existed since the 1980s. So people don't talk about Louisiana that much. But basically, in Louisiana, if you create embryos, you can't destroy them if they develop after 3 days. And there was a couple interviewed recently, a woman called Jessica, and she had no viable embryos, so she couldn't donate them, but she still had to pay to keep them in storage. And there's this, so IVF clinics for the last 40 years.
She's actually very young. She's a genius.
For the last 30 or so years, they've been shipping all these frozen embryos interstate, which is kind of a really logistical nightmare because they have to kind of be kept alive till they hit the border, just so that they can be destroyed. Yeah, and it's really awesome.
Since the 1980s.
So that's been going on since the 1980s. So it's different, but the Alabama law goes one step further because it's not a juridical person, it has personhood, and so the idea that if it's in Louisiana, if it's intentionally destroyed, that's an issue. In Alabama, if it's unintentionally destroyed,
that's an issue.
Yeah, so it's created a real
And Marina details in the book as well, the difficulty for people who are together who created embryos about how long to store them for, and also the cost of storing them it's not like someone will just keep them in some special freezer locker for you, indefinitely in perpetuity. When there's a really interesting article as well that I read recently in the Cut magazine about a couple who got together and they didn't want to get engaged, but they were really happy, and as a sign of their commitment to each other, they mixed their DNA, it's like we're in modern land now, and created frozen embryos. And she then found out that he'd been cheating on her, and then when they were going to get married, he then kind of dumped her. And now they have this decision of what to do with these frozen embryos. So I guess I'm trying to say that there are issues all the way along the spectrum, you know, of maybe, talking about the Alabama Supreme Court saying in a very extreme way, life begins right now, and that is a person, the fetal personhood idea. But for couples who have embryos or people who have embryos, what are some of the other issues that come up if they aren't in a position to use those embryos?
Yeah, so in the US, they, especially like at the start of the century, there was this movement called embryo adoption. So instead of donation, you would adopt embryos. And George W. Bush threw money at it. He took money away from stem cell research. It is really interesting because both kind of are saving lives according to the person that's sort of
who believes
in it, right? Yeah. But there's this embryo adoption movement, and I think Trump also gave money towards that. So the idea that these are living things became even more, it became more emotional. And it is really interesting because some states, after divorces, after breakups, some states will allow the person that will bring the embryo to life to kind of have the ultimate decision. In other states, it's the person that says no, thank you. So it varies, and there's no kind of there's no universal way of doing it.
No. There was a really interesting interview with the first American woman who was an IVF baby. Her name is Elizabeth Carr, and she's kind of come to the fore now and she's also trying to speak up on behalf of reproductive rights and technology. And she's really interesting. She is an advocate for the technology that gave her life. And she was recently interviewed after the Alabama case came down, and she said that she feels like she's an endangered species, which I thought was a really interesting way of putting it. Trust an American to come up with that term. But the reason I want to mention Google her and her mother. The reason her mother had to have IVF is also about medical negligence. So the whole story is really fascinating about what we entrust people to do with our bodies and what we don't. But she works for a genomic company who allow you to screen embryos before you implant them. So it leads us to this other part of technology that you also touch on, this idea of who gets to decide, not only who gets to decide when life begins, who gets to decide what a good life is. And the big thing that happens in Australia is around people who are told that their fetus might have Down syndrome. Yeah. So can I ask you about the Elizabeth Carr thing to begin with? So the not how far is too far, but what are some of the issues you noticed and that you traverse and write about in the book, about how far we allow how far we might allow ourselves to use this technology to make these decisions about what will constitute a good life for a healthy child?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting because I only got to together this afternoon. The genomic prediction, Sam Altman, who started ChatGPT, I think, or one of the AI, he's invested a lot of money into that. And it's a strange company because it I think it over-promises what you can do, because there's something called polygenic traits, which are things like, I don't know, like intellect or whatever, that you can't quite, there's no single gene for it.
Yeah.
So what they're offering is kind of an estimation based on sibling studies that's kind of not, and I didn't realise that that's what she was working for.
Yes.
So whether it works or not is one thing. And just going back, even before picking embryos, there was this guy, maybe 2 decades ago, he created kind of the genius sperm bank using Nobel Prize. He tried to kind of recruit.
And we sound like we're in eugenics territory because we're in eugenics territory.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think he only got one, like, slightly racist Nobel winner. But the people that use these services, like, they're not the type of people that are going to let their kids eat off the floor. Like, they're not going to, so if you're going to pay extra to kind of, to use this, you're probably going to invest more in parenting. Generally. And so it's hard to say whether the technology works in the first place or not.
So we don't need to be scared about it.
Well,
yes.
I mean, you can choose.
You can choose to be scared or not.
There's lots of things to be scared about.
Are these technologies regulated? Is the use of these technologies regulated?
In Australia, it's more regulated. In America, it's not. They think it's regulated, but it's kind of not, because it's in between health and business, and it's kind of in this wonderful no man's land, which isn't really profitable.
Yeah, and there's a lot, especially in the section of Marina's book, which is about IVF, which is this fascinating interplay or collision, really, between technology, science, and commerce. Because initially all the IVF clinics were looking for heterosexual couples who couldn't have children, and then they realised that they weren't going to get as much bang for their buck out of that, and then they went after the single women who wanted to have children, and then they realised they had to widen it and look at queer people who wanted to have children. So it's an interesting kind of, it becomes clear that they're not trying to do access to everyone, but they're looking at furthering their own business model. It comes up again. I wanted to ask you, I mentioned the Down syndrome thing, and you talk about, in the book we talk about the idea of testing for Down syndrome sort of being the canary in the mine when it comes to how parents are told to think about, when to allow a pregnancy to go on or when to think about terminating pregnancy. I mean, there was an ABC article I found recently which has published interviews with people. It was part of the New South Wales birth trauma inquiry. And they detail one particular story of a woman who was told that her baby would have a 1 in 4 chance of having Down syndrome, and straight away she said for personal and religious reasons that she wanted to continue with pregnancy, and she wanted them to note in her file that she did not want to terminate and that she didn't want to discuss termination. And she details in this interview she's given for the inquiry that at every appointment she went to, she was asked when she was going to terminate. And when she gave birth, she was asked when she was giving the baby away. And there's a photo of her with this very gorgeous 3-year-old who has Down syndrome, So there's a very interesting thing about we talk in funny ways about the companies doing eugenics, but we still hold these very particular views and stigmas about whose life is worth keeping and whose life isn't.
Yeah, and it's almost seemed like, abortion is a cure for Down syndrome. So even though people with Down syndrome are living much longer than they were at the start of the century, and all studies sort of indicate that that they're happy, that they have fulfilling lives. We still kind of want normal, for lack of a better word. We kind of want an average child. We don't want to parent different kids, and so I think there's a big part of that. And I remember the second half of the question.
No, it was not so much a question as a reflection about that you write about the way that Down syndrome is that kind of. It's the coalface test for us. Yeah,
and also that research is kind of then taken away from helping people with Down syndrome, especially
to live full lives.
I
want to move on to surrogacy because we haven't talked about it. The Pope weighed in on surrogacy in January this year in a very well publicised speech, calling surrogacy deplorable. The quotes were that it should be a practice that is universally prohibited. And I wondered, I don't mean to sound so sort of naive, why has he taken that stand? But it's not technology, it's not creating a human away from sex. And it's not necessarily creating a child that won't be still within an institution of marriage. What was that about? What does it tell us about how we view surrogacy?
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the exact quote, but it was kind of...
It's a quite intense quote.
Yeah, it's a really intense quote, but it was about, I can't find it, but it was how it humiliated women. What was it?
Yes, it was something about humiliating women.
Yeah, and how it was demeaning to women, which is kind of, the church sort of
weighing in on that.
Yeah, because so many reasons.
Problematic.
But also the idea that the church had no issue making women give their children away for adoption, and suddenly it's unnatural and demeaning to give your child away. So that was awful. But I have to remember the exact quotes, but there were so many aspects wrong with it.
Yeah, but when it comes to surrogacy, you detail in the book that no one in Australia, you can't pay someone to be a surrogate, and you can in the United States, but you can't in the US. Sorry, you can't in Australia. It has to be an act of goodwill.
Yeah, altruistic.
And tell us just quickly, if you can, about some of the people you met, because you met people who really wanted to be surrogates for a whole variety of reasons.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think everything is transactional, and not in a terrible way, but it doesn't have to be financially transactional. Like, I can enjoy your company and therefore I'm your friend. But with surrogacy in Australia, it's altruistic, so you can't pay someone. And I think some of the surrogates, there was one in particular who I interviewed who didn't really know what she wanted, but she knew she wasn't getting it. And I think she realised sort of a few years later that she wanted maybe like to be an auntie in the child's life, but that's not something you can contract for.
No.
So yeah, in her case, that was, and then she sort of got that, but it's not something you can kind of discuss. It's easier to give someone a lump sum of cash almost than to kind of,
try and define this very
from
relationship.
both, yeah.
Is surrogacy still does it still have that same kind of stigma attached to it?
I think it depends where. One lawyer I interviewed, Sarah Jefford, she would absolutely not think she was taken advantage of at any point. She's quite sort of firm and a bit scary. And
was she a surrogate, or she acts on behalf of surrogates?
No, well, both. And what was interesting about her is that she was an egg donor, and she was also a traditional surrogate, which meant that it was her own egg. And like she was very scared that they would make her keep the child. Like that was her greatest fear. And every time they would give past the baby for her to hold, she would freak out that they would leave the baby with her. So it's interesting because it's totally different to what I would have thought.
Yes, and also again the power of Marina's writing is that she gives you all these different stories of how people would behave, and it does make you think, would I do that for a friend? Or how would I feel if that was my way to make a child? But that Marina does, there's no judgment on any of those people. It's this extraordinary experience of reading just these really powerful and compassionate observations of the choices and the ways that people live and the things they're willing to do in order to help people make a family. I want to talk a little bit about fertility fraud. There is a section of the book which I don't want to spoil for people where, and it's not uncommon. There are a lot of articles now. There was a CNN article, there's a New York Times article about people who, that someone gives them a DNA ancestry.com kit for Christmas for fun, and they discover they have 22 half siblings. And in the US, in the CNN article, one of them discovered she dated one of them. And slept with him. So it's really, we're laughing, but it's also really serious. And there are cases like that in Australia, and there's a fabulous section of the book where one woman has discovered that a close family friend who was it's often the fertility specialist who just needs some ready-to-go sperm on hand, and he's the person who fathers 90 children. There's a man in America who fathered 90 children, and now they're trying to do these kind of retrospective laws against it. But I wanted to ask you about this. You write about the issue around anonymity, which is part of how maybe people got into this, the anonymity and the shame that allowed people to do this. But the story from the CNN thing really showed us the depths of how loosely regulated the US fertility industry is. Do we have the same kind of issues here? I mean, you do detail a story that pertains, it happened in South Africa, but they're here now.
Yeah, I think we do. There's sort of small stories, because often these clinics are in certain areas, and they'll attract a certain demographic who are friendly with each other. So there's no reason it won't happen here. But also there's no mechanism to link siblings. And there's also no...
And they'd like to be linked. A lot of the time you write about that they want to know who else might be family.
Yeah, and you have to do it through the donor and sometimes through the clinic. But the clinic isn't a linking service. They don't get paid for it. So whether they do a good job or not is neither here nor there. There's not that much incentive. I mean, maybe I'm being cynical. I don't want to get sued. But there isn't a whole lot of,
But they're not keeping that kind of paperwork as well.
Yeah, and even if they are, they're not going to send a letter each time a child is born. There's a woman, Wendy Kramer, in the US who does a lot of that linking through the donor sibling registry. And but yeah, they're not. And it's quite, I think, scary for even the donor conceived people who do know, because if they're dating, you don't want to sleep with a sibling.
No, absolutely. I wanted to, before we come to your questions, I want to turn us to a couple of good news stories, because there are some good news stories. As I mentioned in the introduction, in late February, Wiggle star Katerina Mete announced that she was pregnant and that she'd used a donor egg. It was part of her announcement on a little video on the Wiggles TV show, and that she'd used donor egg and IVF, and that she'd be a mother on her own at 43, and that she was not in a relationship. I wondered how important are those kinds of stories when they're shared by someone who's really in the public eye, to dispel that stigma, both for the people using the technology and for the children of those people as they grow up?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of the problems that have been created by the technology is shame, and the shame of infertility, and the shame of not meeting a partner, and the shame of not having a family that's considered normal. And so, you know, the more and more you see, or with miscarriage or with anything, people talking about it, the more it destigmatizes it. And yeah, I guess people are less embarrassed, people will talk about it. Like I know between my two kids there was a real difference between the way people spoke about miscarriage, and by the time I was pregnant with my second, people were much more open about it, and I think it was partly because of Beyonce or
people in the public eye.
Yeah, so it does make a difference.
Yeah. Is there still, I mean, the statistics around in the US and in Australia that you quote in the book about the number of people who have utilised IVF are enormously high. You know, it's very common.
Yeah, it's almost, I think, 6% in Australia. So
yeah.
it's big.
Yeah. And did you notice from speaking to people or from the kind of research you gathered for the book that stigma around IVF amongst, you know, not amongst celebrity people, but amongst the people that you met, has that lessened over time, do you think? Or is there still, you talked about the stigma around miscarriage, but is the stigma around IVF diminishing?
Well, it's funny because I feel like everyone I knew that used IVF was fairly open about it. So I didn't realise there was a stigma, but the stigma of male infertility is still quite full on. And especially in Australia because you don't have sperm banks. So the place with the sperm is the same place, it's the clinic. So when men go in there who are infertile and they see the posters, which are these really hypermasculine posters of men in their Speedos or firemen saying, be a hero, like you probably feel like shit if you've got a low sperm count because whatever you are, you're the opposite of that. So yeah, I think for men it's probably not great in that respect, but you know.
Yeah, changing slowly.
Yeah.
The last question I want to have, Marina, and then I promise it's your turn, is about Elizabeth Day, who some of you might have known. She's just been on tour in Australia. She's a very well-known podcaster. Her podcast is called How to Fail, and it's conversations with people, you know, writers like Bernadine Evaristo or Phoebe Waller-Bridge or, you know, Gloria Steinem about failure, the power of failure. She's also a fiction writer and a non-fiction writer. But one of the things she's probably most well known for is being really open about the 12 years she spent, you know, on a fertility journey trying to have a child and not being able to, just trying absolutely everything with her and her husband. And I wondered, you know, what we kind of learn from her story about of what she says now about what it means to live a meaningful life without a child.
Yeah, I mean, we're not used to losing, I think. We're not used to not getting what we want. And there's kind of a language with IVF about fighting, much like terminal illness, and we're not, I think, good as a society with letting go, particularly Western society, and social media has probably made that worse, and there's a sense of gambling about it. And I think for many women or men that kind of have their own off-ramp, it's empowering. It's kind of empowering to decide by yourself when to stop treatment, not when you run out of money, not when the doctor will stop. And I think few people kind of think about it because it feels like giving up, which is a weakness and not something that, you know, we accept.
So many different conceptions of family and different conceptions of the mindset around how we talk to ourselves about fertility and families as well. I promised it's your turn. We're going to turn the lights on. Haley at the back has a microphone, so if you have a question for Marina, we would love to hear from you. Here we go. In a moment we can see you. There you go. Lovely. It's always hard to go first. No, there we go. There we go. We got one. Yeah, you're going to have to stay.
Your book sounds absolutely fascinating, and it must have taken you to so many interesting personal stories. Was there one in particular that you found the most challenging?
Yeah, look, I did two chapters on adoption that I binged, and people were crying, and it's funny because as a journalist I think you always want a news story or you want to interview someone that hasn't been interviewed, but I was interviewing people, and I'm not a psychologist. I would make them deeply upset and I wouldn't really know how to fix it, and I just couldn't write the story in a way that would kind of, you know, make their sort of emotional state, make it worth it. So I got rid of that. But the adoptees, it was particularly heartbreaking because they were in this sort of limbo. Some of them loved the parents that they were raised with and wouldn't have wanted to be raised by their biological parents because they were teenagers when they had them, but equally just were in so much pain at the fact that they were ripped away.
There's one down the front here. Oh, and then we'll come to you in that third row. Thank you.
There is just a follow-up question to that, and that is the ethics of writing stories. Were you particularly challenged around, I don't think I can use this because you can't write it in a truthful way?
Yeah. I interviewed a really horrible fertility doctor who said awful things, but yeah, a lot of the time, I think. And in some ways it would have been a scoop or a better story or made it a better book, but I don't think it would have made people feel better reading it. And, you know, when people share their personal stories, you kind of owe it to them. Well, I felt like I did. I don't like people disliking me, so I think that's a really big part of it.
It's going to be a problem for her as a writer. We're here to help.
Yeah.
And there was a question just here. Yeah, I didn't bring it up.
Look, I have multiple questions, sort of issues around all of this. I worked in IVF, and I have to say that before IVF, there was much more of a sort of a belief or an understanding that having children was a privilege. And now I guess with the whole sort of normalisation and the whole sort of commodification with IVF, it's now about, it's my right, and the government should pay for it as well. So there's that aspect of it, and there's also, you know, regarding what you said about the Pope and the Pope's attitude, I have some very dear friends, a gay couple who went to India and bought 2 children for themselves and said to me, India is full of gay men buying babies. And as happy as I was for them to go and adopt children, or you know, bring children, I don't know, I don't know, there was a term that I sort of came across when I was reading something today where the author referred to being a moral jellyfish, and I kind of felt like I was a moral jellyfish with respect to that.
A great phrase.
Yeah.
And also the whole thing about, there was some research that came out, well, that was coming out, that was saying that because of IVF, we are now breeding generations of children who are subfertile and will need IVF themselves. So any comments on any of those things, I'd love to hear about it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, they're all true. Well, with the particular technique ICSI is the research has, it's still a bit conflicted. So there was one bout of research, but it was a prominent fertility doctor. So with ICSI, you just need one sperm to fertilise an egg, and that's what they do. And then if you have a male child, the idea is that male child would be subfertile. But I think behind that, there's sort of this belief about, you know, what you say, like who deserves kids and who doesn't, and who deserves to breed and who doesn't. And I struggle with the idea that I'm more deserving than someone else, I guess, because I'm not. So I think if it's just luck, then it just seems also unfair that some people can't change their luck.
And I was going to say that the vision that comes to mind for me is like the scales of justice, but I don't mean it literally because it's not about justice, but running all the way through the book is this extraordinary through line about choice, that technology gave us choice. And like we've made, you know, I've been irreverent, we've made jokes about all the, I can choose for my child to be tall and be a great rollerblader, you know, with genomic prediction. But that technology saved lives. You know, you think about, I met people here at the last one in January, you know, who were 20 years older than me, who, you know, if you got pregnant, you got married, and that was your life over. And if you got pregnant and you didn't get married, that was your life over. And if you were a guy who got someone pregnant and you didn't want to marry her, that was your life over. And then we meet those children. We meet the children who grew up with communities who were not ready for them, who couldn't help them. Or we hear about the stories of the women who had the babies taken away from them. And all like the technology gave us this extraordinary choice to, as you say, like it is a privilege, but to decide when and to decide how. And often that choice predominantly falls on women. And I think the extraordinary power of Marina's writing on it is that it opens up all of these portals and leaves you with them, not in a state of chaos, but in a state of going, it's complicated. It's complicated because there's another side to everything. And you're right, it is a privilege to have a child. And it's dangerous for us about who gets to decide who gets to have a child and who doesn't. And we didn't get to talk about adoption tonight, but you know, the stories about adoption where people with more money can go into the countries where, like Haiti, and buy children. And there's a recent story I should urge you all to look at in the ABC News from Georgia, of girls who are now about 21. They found each other online in 2021 and they looked really similar. And I thought it was funny. The girls on social media, and they discovered they are full biological twins, and they were both taken at birth and they were sold to different families. And then there's a story later in the article of a woman who's 77 who gave birth to twin boys who told that they had died, and they've unearthed the casket, and there are no bodies in the casket. So we're also talking about, again, what you said, the commodification, that collision between unregulated things and law and money, or money in particular, and corruption, and this yearning. And I think what I love about what Marina's just said about the Elizabeth Day stuff is that we aren't taught enough how to go, well, I'm not a failure if I don't have a child, and I'm not a failure if I don't get married, and I'll live. I'm not a failure if that illness changes my life in some way. So it's a whole other kind of conception of what we all think of what a meaningful life is. But you're right that we do think it's like, well, I want a child and I should have a child right now. You know, it's complicated, and we all know people who've gone through it. It's awful to go through it. You know, it's enormously detrimental on affecting the body and affecting the relationship with the person you're with. Fascinating. We've got time for a few more of your questions in the middle, and then we'll come to Richard. Thank you.
In your research, I'm just wondering if you touched on the science of what drives people to seek to either biologically give birth or to raise children in the first place.
So interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, to raise, I guess there's this idea that women have a maternal instinct, and Letta Hollingworth, I can never say her name, in 1914 she came out with this paper that said there's no proof for it, because actually infanticide and all these things wouldn't exist if women were all driven to have kids. So in terms of having kids, I'm not sure, and that's socially it's a big part of it. But no, I didn't see that I think there was one study that showed that surrogates were a bit more altruistic, but it depends where, because in America and in places where you can pay for surrogacy, people do it for money. So yeah, it's hard to kind of, not too much.
And there's a great study that Marina quotes in the book about how like having children does not make people happier. Well, I think I'll be happy when I have a child, and they study people and they're like, no, not at all. Big mistake, that one.
Yeah, no, and there was one study that said, oh, you know, it does make you happy, but they realised it was a data mistake.
The book's hilarious. Richard, thank you.
Marina, thank you for writing this incredible book. Is this a topic that follows you once it's in print? Do you have people coming to you with their stories? Do you feel like it's something where you become almost typecast a little bit as a writer about fertility and family?
I don't know, I've kind of avoided people. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I spoke at an event and it was really lovely when people did kind of come up and say thank you, but I think the people that I see are the people that I know, and they never want to hear about this book ever again.
Luckily for you, you've met the rest of us, we do.
Yeah.
All night. Yeah. We've probably got time for one more.
Keep saying that.
There we go, just in the middle. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you. Sorry. Kind of like just two questions, and I don't know whether you touch on these in your book, but one is the idea of chosen families. Do you speak to people that sort of have those sort of families? And the other sort of question was like, I was just wondering, and we touched on it slightly just then in what was mentioned, but like people who are childless by choice. Is that something you sort of talk about in the book, and how do you sort of look at that? Yeah.
So yes, I spoke to people about chosen families, and I guess a lot of the LGBTQ community, they had to have chosen families because they they weren't able to have traditional ones, and that's been happening since the 70s. And the people, I wish I had more multi-parent families, but the people I spoke to who did come from one, they were really happy with the kind of their work-life balance, and they really loved, and their concept of family was really fluid in a way that kind of said, it wasn't fixed, like this is always my mother, and whatever she does, she'll be my mother, and I have to, do X, Y, Z. It was a really fluid concept of family, so that was lovely, and I wish I had more examples of that. And the first chapter is about women who are either childless by choice, so child-free versus childless, and that was kind of amazing because, I remember one woman who was relieved to look post-menopausal because that's when people would stop asking her when she's having a child.